And, people often say, oh, Britain, it's a small, very densely populated country. We can't produce all of our food. But, we pretty much can. I mean, we do produce most of our grain and a lot of meat. We don't produce nearly enough of our fruit and veg. I mean, I would say that as a veg grower, but it's true, but the reasons for that are not really because of the lack of space or ability to grow these things. It's kind of political decisions and ultimately the price of labor relative to the price of energy. But these things are going to change in the world going forward, and we really need to be alive to that.
It's really interesting you mentioned the amount of food that we could produce ourselves here, because now correct me if I'm wrong, because I may have got the figures like slightly wrong. I spoke to Liz Webster, who's like a big sort of pro farming, or she's a farmer herself, but pro farming advocate. She's like done a lot of campaigning about why Brexit's been bad for farmers. She was saying that sometime in the sort of 70s, 80s, we were producing like 95% of our food supply, and now it's down to I think about 60%. So is one of the questions I really always have is how much of our food supply could we realistically produce in this country, and we can go back to the overproduction sort of problem after this, but how much is it like sensible in a sense to import? Like surely there's countries with large areas of land that are going to farm. Is there like a case to have some of the stuff imported and grown abroad, or like meat made abroad, although that seems silly given that we have lovely pastures to graze animals on. But yeah, so how much of our food can we realistically make in this country?
Well, obviously, we're going to struggle to produce the sort of coffee and bananas and things like that
Yeah,
people have become accustomed to. But
coffee.
we can produce. I mean, I've done various sort of kind of glorified back of the envelope calculations in both of my books, and I'm pretty sure that we can produce pretty much all the food that we need. We do have to think about climate change and looking after soils and so on. But it's a matter of kind of taking an interest in it and making it a priority. But as you say, there are countries that can crank out the agricultural commodities and cheap grain in particular. But that's where I think we need to be careful that a lot of those places they don't owe us anything. I think we're sort of moving into a kind of global geopolitical situation that you can see very clearly with the EU, North America, China, Russia. We're moving into some sort of turbulent times geopolitically. So both with food and probably even more so with energy, and sort of food production and energy production are very closely related. We have to be careful about assuming that other people are going to be producing stuff for us, and obviously that has knock-on effects in terms of access to food for other people, global poverty, and so on. So yeah, we can produce most of our food. The real thing is the sort of fruit and the veg. I mean, the way this manifests is that basically fossil energy is cheap, whereas human labor, in a rich country like Britain, is dear. I mean, it kind of is the other way around in poorer countries, and that's kind of the global division of labor. So things like fruit and veg production is labor intensive, or I've taken to using the word job rich, because we have this we have this kind of funny view of farm. When we talk about creating jobs, if you talk about most sectors of the economy, new jobs have been created. People are like, oh, great, new jobs. Whereas the whole narrative in farming is that it's good to get jobs out of farming. But, we've done too much of that, and that's partly why we're not food self-reliant or secure in the UK. We need more people working in farming, and particularly in those job-intensive horticulture sectors, which, and basically that's the kind of food we should be eating. It's healthy for us, diverse, Whole Foods, fresh fruit and veg, it's easy for, the North American prairies to kind of crank out endless grain, which is good for us in moderation, but we eat too much of that in our diet. And bear in mind also climate change. A lot of the real breadbasket parts of the world are kind of continental, semi-arid areas, which are really at risk of climate change and water scarcity. So kind of saying, oh, well, those other guys can produce this stuff for us more cheaply, that's not a good long-term bet. So I think, everywhere we need to be kind of reining in the production, sort of relocalizing it, thinking about its kind of ecological footprint, and thinking about what producing for our needs, not necessarily for our wants, but what kind of diverse diets we can produce locally that feeds everybody well.
Mm. Yeah, and so that touches on this overproduction thing that you mentioned earlier, because there are parts of the world that have, like you said, like massive expanses of land, and they just sort of like crank out grains. And one of the things you mentioned in the interview I talked about with Joe Politics with Ollie, that was, you talked about how a lot of the forces of globalization have pushed certain nations to become specialists at like a handful of crops, and then sort of globally we've become specialists again, like a handful of crops. I think it's like 8 to 10 crops that we produce globally, just like on a monstrous scale.
Yeah.
Why does that drive overproduction? And how bad is the problem? Like how much extra stuff are we making that we don't need?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because depends on how we define need and so on. But I think one of the key issues is feeding arable grains to livestock. I mean, there's a whole sort of very polarized debate around livestock, but the main increase in meat consumption globally is in pigs and chickens, which are fed on arable grains, basically. The whole issue of ruminants, the cattle and sheep and so on, in my opinion, gets a little bit too much airtime. And the real increase is pigs and chickens, because they're fed grains, and that's one of the main sources of overproduction. So I mean, we've got this kind of global economic system that rewards basically sort of profit maximization or net present value. So it's all about cutting input costs and maximizing profits, and that and sort of governments obviously try and make some amends in terms of the impacts of that on people and on nature. But in as much as that kind of global free market profit motive driven system drives the economy, that's what you get. You get people producing as whatever they can sell, advantageously wherever they can sell it. And I suppose that manifests locally. A wonderful book published recently by a guy called Carwyn Graves, Tyr, the story of the Welsh landscape, and he shows very nicely in his book, that here in the UK, one of the major arguments about overproduction is about sheep in the uplands, and too many sheep in Wales being bad for the environment and so on. And I mean, he basically shows how there was a wonderfully diverse local agriculture in Wales historically, lots of fruit production, vegetables, cattle more than sheep, that were well integrated into the sort of local upland ecology. And that is kind of blown away by that, essentially by government policies supporting that kind of global marketization. So when you kind of, if you ask, can Wales feed itself well, the answer is yes. But if the question is, what can Wales produce most advantageously into the global agricultural commodity markets, the answer is, well, probably sheep. And that's what drives the overproduction of sheep. So that's the problem. It's kind of overproduction of commodity crops for a global market rather than producing what people need to eat locally. What a kind of healthy, diverse local diet. And every part of the world essentially has a historic agriculture which is which is well keyed to a sort of low energy input agriculture, which is well keyed to a local the local ecology, whatever it happens to be, and that can produce diverse food. As you say, we've moved away from that and sort of moved towards this small number of these kind of giant global commodity crops, wheat, soy, maize, canola, rapeseed, as we call it here, those kind of crops, which certainly have their place. But you can have too much of a good thing.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out. And you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.